The Geography of the Thought. How Asians and Westerners Think Differently, and Why. Richard Nisbet. Introduction. A few years back, a brilliant student from China began to work with me on the question of social psychology and reasoning. One day early in our acquaintance, he said, "You know, the difference between you and me is that I think the world is a circle and you think it's a line." Unfazed by what must have been startled expression on my face, he expounded on that theme. The Chinese believe in constant change. But with things always moving back to some prior state. They pay attention to a wide range of events. They search for relationships between the things, and they think you can't understand the part without understanding the whole. Westerners live in a simpler, more deterministic world. They focus on a salient object or people instead of the larger picture, and they think they can control events because they know the rules that govern the behavior of objects. Sure. I was skeptical but intrigued. I had been a lifelong universalist concerning the nature of human thought, marching in a step with a long Western line from the British empiricist philosophers such as Hume, Locke, and Mill to modern-day cognitive scientists. I believed that all human groups perceive and reason in the same way. The shared assumption of this tradition can be summarized with a few principles. Everyone has the same basic cognitive processes. Maori herders, Kung hunter-gatherers, and .com entrepreneurs all rely on the same tools for perception, memory, causal analysis, categorization, and inference. When people in one culture differ from those in another in their beliefs, it can't be because they have different cognitive processes, but because they are exposed to a different aspect of their world, or because they have been taught different things. Higher order processes of reasoning rest on the formal rules of logic. For example, the prohibition against contradiction. A proposition can't be both true and false. Reasoning is a separate from what is reasoned about. The same process can be used to think about utterly different things, and a given thing can be reasoned about using any number of different procedures. A dozen years before meeting my student, I had co-authored with Lee Ross a book with a title that made by my sympathies clear: Human Inference. Hot Western inference, and certainly not American college student inference, but human inference. The book characterized what I took to be the inferential rules that people everywhere use to understand the world, including some rules that I believed were fluid and capable of producing enormous judgments. On the other hand, shortly before I met my new Chinese student, I had just completed a series of studies examining whether people's reasoning could be improved by teaching them new rules for thinking. Given my assumption about universality and hard writing, I had initially assumed the work would show that it is difficult, if not impossible, to change the patterns of reasoning. I had been studying, even with immersion in long courses of the study in the fields such as statistics and economics. But, to my surprise, I found substantial training effects. For example, people who have taken a new statistics course avoid lots of errors in a daily life. They are more likely to see that the sophomore slump in the baseball could be due to the statistical regression to the mean rather than to some mystical curse, and more likely to realize that an interview should be regarded as a small sample of a person's behavior, and therefore that a wise hiring decision should be based on their larger sample of information in the application folder. Yes. Economists, it turns out, think differently about all sorts of things than the rest of us do, from deciding whether to remain at a boring movie to reasoning about foreign policy. Moreover, I found it was possible to train people in brief sessions and change not only their thinking habits, but their actual behavior when we tested them surreptitiously outside the laboratory. So I was willing to give the student, whose name is Kapin Penn and who now teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, an attentive hearing. If it's possible to produce marked change in the way adults think, it certainly seemed possible that indoctrination into the distinctive habits of the sorts from birth could result in very large cultural differences in habits of sorts. I began reading comparative literature on the nature of thoughts by philosophers, historians, and anthropologists, both Eastern and Western, and found that Peng had been faithful reporter. Whereas psychologists have assumed universality, many scholars in other fields believe that Westerners, primarily Europeans, Americans, and citizens of British Commonwealth, and East Asian, principally the people of China, Korea, and Japan, have maintained very different systems of thought for thousands of years. Moreover, these scholars are in substantial agreement about the nature of these differences. For example, most who have addressed the question hold that European thoughts rest on the assumption that behavior of objects, physical, animal, and human, can be understood in terms of straightforward rules. Westerners have a strong interest in the categorization, which helps them to know what rules to apply to the object in the question, and formal logic plays a role in the problem solving. Sure. East Asian, in contrast, attend to object in their broad context. Yeah. The world seems more complex to Asian than to the Westerners, and understanding events always requires consideration of a host of factors that operate in relation to one another in no simple, deterministic way. Formal logic plays a little role in problem solving. In fact, the person who is too concerned with logic may be considered immature. Yeah. As a psychologist, I found these assertions to be revolutionary in their implications. If the scholars in the humanities and other social sciences were right, then the cognitive scientists were wrong. Human cognition is not everywhere the same. Without putting it in so many words, humanities and social science scholars were making extremely important claims about the nature of thought. First, that members of different cultures differ in their metaphysics or fundamental beliefs about the nature of the world. Second, that characteristic thought processes of different groups differ greatly. Third, that the thought process are of a piece with beliefs about the nature of the world. People use the cognitive tools that seems to make sense, given the sense they make of the world. I see. Just as remarkably, the social structures and the sense of self that are characteristic of Easterners and Westerners seems to fit hand in the glove with their respective belief systems and cognitive processes. The collective or interdependent nature of Asian society is consistent with Asians' broad contextual view of the world and their belief that events are highly complex and determined by many factors. The individualistic or independent nature of Western society seems consistent with a Western focus on their particular object in isolation from their context and with Westerners' belief that they can know the rules governing object and therefore can control the object behavior. If people really do differ profoundly in their systems of thought, their worldview and cognitive processes, then differences in the people's attitudes and beliefs and even their values and preferences might not be a matter merely of different of inputs and teachings, but rather an inevitable consequences of using different tools to understand the world, of course. And if that's true, then efforts to improve international understanding may be less likely to pay off than one might hope. I see. Makes sense. My students' chance comments, together with my interest in the cultural psychology and the resulting reading program he had encouraged, launched me on a new course of research. I began a series of comparative studies, working with a student at the University of Michigan and eventually with colleagues at the Beijing University, Kyoto University, Seoul National University, and the Chinese Institute of Psychology. The research shows that there are indeed dramatic differences in the nature of Asian and European thought processes. The evidence lends support to the claim of non-psychologist scholars and extends those claims to many surprising new mental phenomena. In addition, surveys and observational research documents differences in social practices that dovetail with the differences in the habits of thought. The new research has provided us, as prior evidence could not, with enough information so that we can build a theory about the nature of these differences, including how they might have come about, what their implications are for perceiving and reasoning in everyday life, and how they affect relations between the people from different cultures. The research allows us to answer many questions about social relations and thought that have long puzzled educators, historians, psychologists, and philosophers of science. Neither common stereotypical views about East-West differences nor the more sophisticated view of scholars can answer these questions or deal with the new findings. The puzzle and new observations range across many different domains. For example, Science and mathematics. Why would the ancient Chinese have excelled at algebra and arithmetic, but not geometry, of course, which was a forte of the Greeks? Why do modern Asians excel at math and science but produce less in the way of revolutionary science than Westerners? Yes. Attention and perception. Why are East Asians better? Oh, sorry. Let me repeat it again. Science and mathematics. Why would the ancient Chinese have excelled at algebra and arithmetic, but not geometry, which was a forte of the Greeks? Why do the modern Asians excel at math and science, but produce less in the way of revolutionary science than Westerners? Attention and perception. Why are East Asians better able to see relationship among events than the Westerners are? Why do East Asians find it relatively difficult to disentangle an object from its surroundings? Casual inference. Why are Westerners so likely to overlook the influence of the context on the behavior of objects and even of people? Why are Easterners more susceptible to the hindsight bias, which allows them to believe that they knew it all along? Organization of knowledge. Why do Western infants learn nouns at a much more rapid rate than the verbs, where the Eastern infants learn verbs at a more rapid rate than the nouns? I didn't know that. Why do East Asian group objects and events based on how they relate to one another, whereas Westerners are more likely to rely on categories? Classification, right? Missy, right? Reasoning. Why are Westerners more likely to apply formal logic when reasoning about everyday events, and why does their insistence on logic sometimes cause them to make error? Why are Easterners so willing to entertain apparently contradictory propositions, and how can this sometimes be helpful in getting at the truth? Let's see. Where to look for the causes of such a vastly different system of thought? Do they lie in the biology, language, economics, social systems? What keeps them going today? Social practices, education, inertia, and where are we headed with the differences? Will they still be here 50 or 500 years from now? My research has led me to the conviction that two utterly different approaches to the world have maintained themselves for thousands of years. These approaches include profoundly different social relations, views about the nature of the world, and characteristic thought processes. Each of these orientations, the Western and the Eastern, is a self-reinforcing homeostatic system. The social practices promote the worldviews. The worldviews dictate the appropriate thought processes, and the thought process both justifies the worldviews and supports the social practices. Understanding these homeostatic systems has implications for grasping the fundamental nature of the mind, for beliefs about how we ought ideally to reason, and for appropriate education strategies for different peoples. I see. Perhaps most important of all, The book has implications for how East and West can get along better through mutual understanding of mental differences. Many people in Eastern countries believe, with some justice, that the past 500 years of Western military, political, and economic dominances have made the West intellectually and morally arrogant. This book will have achieved its purpose for Western leaders if it causes them to consider the possibility that another valid approach to thinking about the world exists, and that it can serve as a mirror with which to examine and critique their own beliefs and habits of mind. Oh, that's interesting, that's fair. The book will have served its purpose for Asian leaders if it encourages them to consider the complementary possibility. Through the need is perhaps less urgent for them because most Eastern intellectuals are already familiar to a considerable degree with Western ways of thinking. Yes, me myself. To establish the contention that very different systems of perception and thought exist and have existed for thousands of years, I draw on historical and philosophical evidence as well as modern social science research, including ethnographies, surveys, and laboratory research. In Chapter 1, Aristotle and Confucius are presented as an example of two different systems of thought. Undoubtedly, those philosophers also served to entrench habits of thought that were already characteristic of their societies. But Chapter 2 and 3 are intended to show that the social practice differences found in modern societies would tend to sustain or even to create those different patterns, even if they have not been present in the ancient times. The heart of the book is contained in the chapters 4 to 7. They present evidence that fundamental beliefs about the nature of the world, as well as the way of perceiving it and reasoning about it, differ dramatically among modern peoples. The evidence is based in good part on the laboratory research that I have conducted with students and colleagues using a variety of tests to examine how people perceive, remember, and think. Chapter 8 spells out some of the implications for psychology, philosophy, and society of the deep differences in the system of thought we have discovered. The epilogue speculates about where we are headed, towards convergence or towards continued or even intensified separation. That's savvy. To set the stage a bit for the research that follows. When I speak of East Asia, I mean China and the countries that were heavily influenced by its culture, most notably Japan and Korea. I will sometimes abbreviate East Asian to Easterner and sometimes to Asian. When I speak of Westerners, I mean people of European culture. When I speak of European Americans, I mean blacks and whites and Hispanics. Anyone but people of Asian descent. This somewhat odd usage can be justified by the fact that everyone born and raised in America is exposed to a similar sort of course, not by any means identical cultural influences. This is true of Asian Americans too, obviously. But in some of the research discussed, they are examined as a separate group because we would expect them to be more similar to Asian than we would expect other Americans to be. And in fact, this is what we find. Really? Wow. So the Asian descent in the States still hold their the backgrounds, right? Like a thinking thought process, right? Wow. Finally, I wish to apologize in advance to those people who will be upset to see videos of people labeled with the simple term East Asian and treated as if they are identical. I do not mean to suggest that they are even close to being identical. The cultures and subcultures of East differ as dramatically from one another as do those of the West. Sure. But the broad brush term East Asian can be justified in a host of the social and political ways. The culture in that region are, in some general respect, similar to one another and different from Western countries. This will not satisfy some people who are highly knowledgeable about the East, but I ask them to bear with me. Some generalizations are justified despite the myriad differences. An analogy can be drawn to the study of language groups. Indo-European languages differ from one another in countless ways, and East Asian languages differ at least as much. Nevertheless, generalizations about the differences between the Indo-European languages and East Asian languages taken as a group are possible and meaningful, and as we will be seeing, some of those high-level generalizations are remarkably similar to some of the differences in the perceptual and thought process examined in this book.